a line that continues that the Court need not decide. The Court then proceeds to the delimitation of the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf within 200 nautical miles from the coast of the parties. The relevant provisions of the Convention for this exercise are contained in Article 74 of UNCLOS for the delimitation of the exclusive economic zone and Article 83 for the delimitation of the continental shelf. These provisions are of a very general nature and do not provide much by way of guidance for those involved in maritime delimitation exercise. The goal of that exercise is the achievement of an equitable solution. If two states have freely agreed on a maritime boundary, they are deemed to have achieved such an equitable solution. However, if they fail to reach agreement on their maritime boundary and the matter is submitted to the Court, it is the task of the Court to find an equitable solution in the maritime delimitation it has been requested to effect. Since the adoption of the Convention, the Court has gradually developed a maritime delimitation methodology to assist it in carrying out its task. In determining the maritime delimitation line, the Court proceeds in three stages, which is described in the case concerning maritime delimitation in the Black Sea, Romania versus Ukraine. In the first stage, the Court will establish the provisional equidistance line from the most appropriate base points on the coast of the parties. The Court will, in the second stage, consider whether there are factors calling for the adjustment or shifting of the provisional equidistance line in order to achieve an equitable result. In the third and final stage, the Court will submit the envisaged delimitation line, either the equidistance line or the adjusted line, to the disproportionality test. The purpose of this test is to assure the Court that there is no marked disproportion between the ratio of the lengths of the relevant coasts of the parties and the ratio of their respective shares of the parties in the relevant area to be delimited by the envisaged line, and thus to confirm that the delimitation achieves an equitable solution as required by the Convention. The Court observes that the three-stage methodology is not prescribed by the Convention and therefore is not mandatory. It has been developed by the Court in its jurisprudence on maritime delimitation as part of its effort to arrive at an equitable solution as required by Articles 74 and 83 of the Convention. The methodology is based on objective geographical criteria, while at the same time taking into account any relevant circumstances bearing on the equitableness of the maritime boundary. It has brought predictability to the process of maritime delimitation and has been applied by the Court in a number of past cases. The three-stage methodology for maritime delimitation has also been used by international tribunals. The Court will not use the three-stage methodology if there are factors which make the application of the equidistance method inappropriate. For instance, if the construction of an equidistance line from the coast is not feasible. This, however, is not the case in the present circumstances, where such a line can be constructed. Moreover, the Court does not consider the use of a parallel of latitude as the appropriate methodology to achieve an equitable solution as suggested by Kenya. A boundary along the parallel of latitude would produce a severe cutoff effect on the maritime projections of the southernmost coast of Somalia. The Court therefore sees no reason in the present case to depart from its usual practice of using the three-stage methodology to establish the maritime boundary between Somalia and Kenya in the exclusive economic zone and on the continental shelf. The Court first identifies the relevant coasts of the parties, namely those coasts whose projections overlap. The Court, using radial projections which overlap within 200 nautical miles, has identified that the relevant coast of Somalia extends for approximately 733 kilometers and that of Kenya for approximately 511 kilometers. The Court notes that the parties disagree as to the identification of the relevant area. The Court has explained on a number of occasions that the relevant area comprises that part of the maritime space in which the potential entitlements of the parties overlap. The Court also recalls its observation that the relevant area cannot extend beyond the area in which the entitlements of both parties overlap. The Court is of the view that in the north, the relevant area extends as far as the overlap of the maritime projections of the coast of Kenya and the coast of Somalia. The Court considers it appropriate to use the overlap of the 200 nautical mile radial projections from the land boundary terminus. As far as the southern limit of the relevant area is concerned, the Court notes that the parties agree that the maritime space south of the boundary that Kenya and Tanzania, south of the boundary between Kenya and Tanzania is not part of the relevant area. The relevant area, as identified by the court for the purpose of delimiting the exclusive economic zone and continental shelf up to 200 nautical miles from the coast measures approximately 212,844 square kilometers. The court next constructs the provisional equidistance line. It first identifies the base points it considers appropriate for the construction of the provisional equidistance line within 200 nautical miles of the coast. The provisional equidistance line is constructed on the basis of these base points, and it begins from the endpoint of the maritime boundary in the territorial sea, point A, and continues until it reaches 200 nautical miles from the starting point of the maritime boundary at a point with the coordinates indicated in the judgment. The resulting line is depicted on sketch map 9, which is now shown on the screen. The court next considers whether there are factors requiring the adjustment or shifting of the provisional equidistance line in order to achieve an equitable solution. The court recalls that Kenya perceives the provisional equidistance line as inequitable, while Somalia does not see any plausible reason for adjusting the line and believes that it would constitute an equitable boundary. The court notes that Kenya, by invoking various factors which it considers as constituting relevant circumstances in the context of this case, has consistently sought a maritime boundary that would follow the parallel of latitude. The court has already concluded that no maritime boundary between Somalia and Kenya following the parallel of latitude was established in the past. Nor has the court accepted the methodology based on the parallel of latitude for establishing the maritime boundary between the parties as advocated by Kenya. Kenya equitable access to fisheries resources that are vital to its population. The Court then turns to Kenya's argument that the party's long-standing and consistent conduct in relation to oil concessions, naval patrols, fishing, and other activities reflects the existence of a de facto maritime boundary along the parallel of latitude, which calls for adjustment of the provisional equidistance line. The Court has already concluded that no maritime boundary along the parallel of latitude has been agreed by the parties. There is no de facto maritime boundary between Somalia and Kenya. The Court therefore cannot accept the argument of Kenya that, on the basis of conduct of the parties, the provisional equidistance line has to be adjusted so that it coincides with the alleged de facto maritime boundary. The Court next considers the two remaining arguments that, according to Kenya, call for adjustment of the provisional equidistance line. Kenya submits that the application of an equidistance line would produce a significant cutoff effect with respect to its maritime areas. It also points out that the cutoff effect produced by the equidistance line is severely exacerbated past the 200 nautical mile limit, essentially to the point that Kenya would be completely cut off from the outer limit of the continental shelf. Kenya further argues that the regional context and practice require the adjustment of the provisional equidistance line. The Court and international tribunals have acknowledged that the use of the equidistance line can produce a cutoff effect, particularly where the coastline is characterized by concavity. In 1985, the Court reaffirmed that an equidistance line may yield a disproportionate result where a coast is markedly concave or convex. The International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, while stating that in the delimitation of exclusive economic zone and continental shelf concavity is not necessarily a relevant circumstance, has also confirmed that when an equidistance line drawn between two states produces a cutoff effect on the maritime entitlement of one of the two states as a result of the concavity of the coast, then an adjustment of that line may be necessary in order to reach an equitable result. The Court considers that any cutoff effect as a result of the Kenya maritime boundary is not a relevant circumstance. The agreements between Kenya and Tanzania are res inter aelios actos. They cannot per se affect the maritime boundary between Kenya and Somalia. However, the issue to be considered in the present case is whether the use of an equidistance line produces a cutoff effect for Kenya not as a result of the agreed boundary between Kenya and Tanzania, but as a result of the configuration of the coastline. If the examination of the coastline is limited only to the coasts of Kenya and Somalia, any concavity is not conspicuous. However, by examining only the coastlines of the two states concerned to assess the extent of any cutoff effect resulting from the geographic configuration of the coastline may be an overly narrow approach. Examining the concavity of the coastline in a broader geographical configuration is consistent with the approach taken by this Court and international tribunals. In the two North Sea continental shelf cases, the Court examined the coasts of 3 states with Germany in the middle. The Court did so in the context of proceedings that had been joined, although the cases themselves remained separate. The Court noted that although 2 separate delimitations were in question, they involved, indeed actually gave rise to, a single situation. The Court emphasized that the fact that the question of either of these delimitations might have arisen and called for settlement separately in point of time does not alter the character of the problem with which the Court is actually faced. In both the Bangladesh-Myanmar and Bangladesh versus India cases, even though the issue was that of a boundary between the 2 respective states, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in the former case and the Arbitral Tribunal in the latter each looked at the concavity of the coast of the 3 states as a whole, with Bangladesh in the middle. In the present case, the potential cutoff of Kenya's maritime entitlements should be assessed in a broader geographical context. The potential cutoff of Kenya's maritime entitlements cannot be properly observed by examining the coasts of Kenya and Somalia in isolation. When the mainland coasts of Somalia, Kenya, and Tanzania are observed together as a whole, the coastline is undoubtedly concave. Kenya faces a cutoff of its maritime entitlements as the middle state located between Somalia and Tanzania. The presence of Pemba Island, a large and populated island that appertains to Tanzania, accentuates this cutoff effect because of its influence on the course of a hypothetical equidistance line between Kenya and Tanzania, as shown by sketch map number 10, now appearing on the screen. The provisional equidistance line between Somalia and Kenya progressively narrows the coastal projection of Kenya, substantially reducing its maritime entitlements within 200 nautical miles. This cutoff effect occurs as a result of the configuration of the coastline extending from Somalia to Tanzania, independently of the boundary line agreed between Kenya and Tanzania, which in fact mitigates that effect in the south, in the exclusive economic zone and on the continental shelf up to 200 nautical miles. The Court recalls its jurisprudence and that of international tribunals, according to which an adjustment of the provisional equidistance line is warranted if the cutoff effect is serious or significant. In the view of the Court, even though the cutoff effect in the present case is less pronounced than in some other cases, it is nonetheless still serious enough to warrant some adjustment to address the substantial narrowing of Kenya's potential entitlements. The Court has affirmed that the achievement of an equitable solution requires that, so far as possible, the line of delimitation should allow the coasts of the parties to produce their effects in terms of maritime entitlements in a reasonable and mutually balanced way. This is an important standard to be used in making an adjustment to the provisional equidistance line. The Court, however, bears in mind the following principles. There is no question of refashioning geography or compensating for the inequalities of nature. Equity does not necessarily apply equality, and there can be no question of distributive justice. In other words, an adjustment should not produce an unreasonable result for Somalia. In order to attenuate the cutoff effect described earlier, the Court considers it reasonable to adjust the provisional equidistance line. In view of the above considerations, the Court believes that it is necessary to shift the line to the north so that from point A it follows a geodetic line with an initial azimuth of 114 degrees. This line would attenuate in a reasonable and mutually balanced way the cutoff effect produced by the unadjusted equidistance line due to the geographic configuration of the coasts of Somalia, Kenya, and Tanzania. The resulting line would end at its intersection with the 200 nautical mile limit from the coast of Kenya at a point B, with the coordinates indicated in paragraph 174 of the judgment. The adjusted line is depicted in sketch map number 11, now appearing on screen. In the final stage, the Court checks whether the envisaged delimitation line leads to a significant disproportionality between the ratio of the lengths of the parties' respective relevant coasts and the ratio of the size of the relevant area apportioned by the line. As mentioned earlier, the relevant coast of Somalia is 733 kilometers, and that of Kenya is 511 kilometers long. The ratio of the relevant coast is 1 to 1.43 in favor of Somalia. The maritime boundary determined by the Court divides the relevant area within 200 nautical miles of the coast in such a way that approximately 120,455 square kilometers would appertain to Kenya, and the remaining part, measuring approximately 92,389 square kilometers, would appertain to Somalia. The ratio between the maritime zones that would appertain respectively to Kenya and Somalia is 1 to 1.3 in favor of Kenya. A comparison of these two ratios does not reveal any significant or marked disproportionality. The Court is thus satisfied that the adjusted line that it has established as the maritime boundary for the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelves of Somalia and Kenya within 200 nautical miles in the Indian Ocean described earlier achieves an equitable solution as required by Article 74, Paragraph 1 and Article 83, Paragraph 1 of the Convention. The Court finally turns to the question of the delimitation of the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles. It is recalled that both parties have asked the Court to determine the complete course of the maritime boundary between them, including the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles. The Court recalls that any claim of continental shelf rights beyond 200 nautical miles by a state party to UNCLOS must be in accordance with Article 76 of UNCLOS and reviewed by the Commission on the limits of the continental shelf established thereunder. The Court observes that both states have made submissions on the limits of the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles to the Commission in accordance with Article 76, Paragraph 8 of the Convention. The Court notes that both Somalia and Kenya have fulfilled their obligations under Article 76 of the Convention. At the same time, the Commission has yet to consider these submissions and make any recommendations to Somalia and Kenya on matters related to the establishment of the outer limits of their continental shelves. It is only after such recommendations are made that Somalia and Kenya can establish final and binding outer limits of their continental shelves in accordance with Article 76, Paragraph 8 of UNCLOS. The Court emphasizes that the lack of delineation of the outer limit of the continental shelf is not, in and of itself, an impediment to the delimitation between two states with adjacent coasts, as is the case here. The Court observes that the entitlement of the parties to the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles are to be determined by reference to the outer limit of the continental margin, to be ascertained in accordance with Article 76, Paragraphs 4 and 5 of UNCLOS. The entitlement of a state to the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles depends on geological and geomorphological criteria subject to the constraints set out in Article 76, Paragraph 5. An essential step in any delimitation is to determine whether there are entitlements and whether they overlap. The situation in the present case is not the same as that addressed by the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in the Bangladesh-Myanmar case. In that case, the unique situation of the Bay of Bengal and the negotiation record at the Third United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea, which threw particular light on the parties' contentions on the subject, were sufficient to enable the tribunal to proceed with the delimitation of the area beyond 200 nautical miles. The Court notes that in their submissions to the Commission, both Somalia and Kenya claim on the basis of scientific evidence a continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles, and that their claims overlap. In most of the area of overlapping claims beyond 200 nautical miles, both parties claim that their continental shelf extends to the maximum distance of 350 nautical miles. The Court further notes that neither party questions the existence of the other party's entitlement to a continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles or the extent of that claim. Their dispute concerns the boundary delimiting the shelf between them. Both parties in their submissions, Somalia in those presented at the close of the hearings and Kenya in its rejoinder, request the Court to delimit the maritime boundary between them in the Indian Ocean up to the outer limit of the continental shelf. For the reasons just set out, the Court proceeds to do so. As regards the relevant circumstances invoked by Kenya for adjustment of the provisional equidistance line, the Court has already considered them earlier and adjusted the line accordingly in the exclusive economic zone and on the continental shelf up to 200 nautical miles. The Court recalls that both Somalia and Kenya have claimed a continental shelf extending up to 350 nautical miles in the greater part of the area of overlapping claims. In view of the foregoing, the Court considers it appropriate to extend the geodetic line used for the delimitation of the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf within 200 nautical miles to delimit the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles. The Court therefore concludes that the maritime boundary beyond 200 nautical miles continues along the same geodetic line as the adjusted line within 200 nautical miles until it reaches the outer limit of the parties' continental shelves, which are to be delineated by Somalia and Kenya respectively on the basis of the recommendations to be made by the Commission, or until it reaches the area where the rights of third states may be affected. The direction of that line is depicted on sketch map number 12, now appearing on the screen. Depending on the extent of Kenya's entitlement to a continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles, as it may be established in the future on the basis of the Commission's recommendation, the delimitation line might give rise to an area of limited size located beyond 200 nautical miles from the coast of Kenya and within 200 nautical miles from the coast of Somalia, but on the Kenyan side of the delimitation line. This possible gray area is depicted on sketch map number 12. Since the existence of this gray area is only a possibility, the Court does not consider it necessary in the circumstances of the present case to pronounce itself on the legal regime that would be applicable in that area. The complete course of the maritime boundary is shown on sketch map number 13, now appearing on the screen. In its final submissions, Somalia also requests the Court to adjudge and declare that Kenya, by its conduct in the disputed area, has violated its international obligations and is responsible under international law to make full reparation to Somalia. Somalia, however, stated during the oral proceedings that it does not insist on compensation for past violations. It asks the court to order Kenya to cease its wrongful acts and to make available to Somalia the technical data acquired in areas that are determined by the court to be subject to the sovereignty or sovereign rights and jurisdiction of Somalia. The court first examines the applicant's argument that by its unilateral actions in the disputed area, Kenya has violated Somalia's sovereignty over its territorial sea and its sovereign rights and jurisdiction in the exclusive economic zone and on the continental shelf. The court recalls that Somalia's submission is made in the context of proceedings regarding a maritime boundary which has not been settled prior to the decision of the court. The consequence of the court's judgment is that the maritime boundary has now been delimited between the parties. The court considers that when maritime claims of states overlap, maritime activities undertaken by a state in an area which is subsequently attributed to another state by a judgment cannot be considered to be in violation of the sovereign rights of the latter if those activities were taken before the judgment was delivered and if the area concerned was the subject of claims made in good faith by both states. Somalia complains of surveying and drilling activity conducted or authorized by Kenya in an area located entirely or partially north of the equidistant line claimed by Somalia as the maritime boundary. There is no evidence that Kenya's claims over the area were not made in good faith. Under the circumstances, the court concludes that it has not been established that Kenya's maritime activities, including those that may have been conducted in parts of the disputed area that have now been attributed to Somalia, were in violation of Somalia's sovereignty or its sovereign rights and jurisdiction. The court then turns to the applicant's argument that Kenya's activities were in violation of Article 74, Paragraph 3 and Article 83, Paragraph 3 of UNCLOS. Under those provisions, states with opposite or adjacent coasts that have not reached an agreement on the delimitation of the exclusive economic zone or continental shelf are under an obligation to make every effort during this transitional period not to jeopardize or hamper the reaching of a final agreement. The court considers that the transitional period mentioned in those provisions refers to the period after the maritime delimitation dispute has been established until a final delimitation by agreement or adjudication has been achieved. As previously noted, the court is of the view that a maritime delimitation dispute between the parties has been established since 2009. Accordingly, the court only examines whether the activities conducted by Kenya after 2009 jeopardized or hampered the reaching of a final agreement on the delimitation of the maritime boundary. The court observes that Somalia complains of certain activities, including the award of oil concession blocks to private operators and the performance of seismic and other surveys in those blocks, which are of a transitory character. These activities are not of the kind that could lead to permanent physical change in the marine environment, and it has not been established that they had the effect of jeopardizing or hampering the reaching of a final agreement on the delimitation of the maritime boundary. Somalia also complains of certain drilling activities, which are of the kind that could lead to permanent physical change in the marine environment. Such activities may alter the status quo between parties to a maritime dispute and could jeopardize or hamper the reaching of a final agreement. However, the court concludes that on the basis of the evidence before it, it is not in a position to determine with sufficient certainty that drilling operations that could have led to a permanent physical change in the disputed area took place after 2009. The court further notes that in 2014, the parties engaged in negotiations on maritime delimitation and that in 2016, Kenya suspended its activities in the disputed area and offered to enter into provisional arrangements with Somalia. In light of these circumstances, the court cannot conclude that the activities carried out by Kenya in the disputed area jeopardized or hampered the reaching of a final agreement on the delimitation of the maritime boundary in violation of Article 74, Paragraph 3 or Article 83, Paragraph 3 of UNCLOS. For these reasons, the court finds that Kenya has not violated its international obligations through its maritime activities in the disputed area. Since Kenya's international responsibility is not engaged, the court need not examine Somalia's request for reparation. Somalia's submission must therefore be rejected. The maritime boundary between the parties having been determined, the court expects that each party will fully respect the sovereignty, sovereign rights, and jurisdiction of the other in accordance with international law. I shall now read out the operative part of the judgment. For these reasons, the Court, 1, unanimously finds that there is no agreed maritime boundary between the Federal Republic of Somalia and the Republic of Kenya that follows the parallel of latitude described in paragraph 35 above. 2, unanimously decides that the starting point of the single maritime boundary delimiting the respective maritime areas between the Federal Republic of Somalia and the Republic of Kenya is the intersection of the straight line extending from the final permanent boundary beacon, PB29, at right angles to the general direction of the coast with the low water line, at the point with coordinates 1 degree, 39 minutes, 44 seconds south, and 41 degrees, 33 minutes, 34.4 seconds east, WGS 84. 3, unanimously decides that from the starting point, the maritime boundary in the territorial sea follows the median line described at paragraph 117 above until it reaches the 12 nautical mile limit at the point with coordinates 1 degree, 47 minutes, 39.1 seconds south, and 41 degree, 43 minutes, 46.8 seconds east, WGS 84. Point A. 4, by 10 votes to 4, decides that from the end of the boundary in the territorial sea, point A, the single maritime boundary delimiting the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf up to 200 nautical miles between the Federal Republic of Somalia and the Republic of Kenya follows the geodetic line starting with azimuth 114 degrees until it reaches the 200 nautical mile limit, measured from the baselines from which the breadth of the territorial sea of the Republic of Kenya is measured, at the point with coordinates 3 degrees, 4 minutes, 21.3 seconds south, and 44 degrees, 35 minutes, 30.7 seconds east, WSG 84. Point B. In favor, President Donahue, Vice President Gevorgian, Judges Tomka, Benuna, Shwe, Sebatunde, Robinson, Iwasawa, Nolte, Judge Ad hoc Guillaume. Against, Judges Abraham, Yusuf, Bandari, Salam. 5, by 9 votes to 5, decides that from point B, the maritime boundary delimiting the continental shelf continues along the same geodetic line until it reaches the outer limits of the continental shelf or the area where the rights of third states may be affected. In favor, President Donahue, Vice President Gevorgian, Judges Tomka, Benuna, Shwe, Sebatunde, Iwasawa, Nolte, Judge Ad hoc Guillaume. Against, Judges Abraham, Yusuf, Bandari, Robinson, Salam. 6, unanimously rejects the claim by the Federal Republic of Somalia on its final submission number 4. I now call upon the registrar to read the operative part of the judgment in French.
Par ces motifs, la Cour 1. À l'unanimité, dit qu'il n'existe pas de frontière maritime convenue entre la République fédérale de Somalie et la République du Kenya, longeant le parallèle décrit au paragraphe 35 ci-dessus. 2. À l'unanimité, décide que le point de départ de la frontière maritime unique, délimitant les espaces maritimes respectifs de la République fédérale de Somalie et de la République du Kenya, est situé à l'intersection de la ligne droite partant de la dernière borne frontière permanente, PP 29, à angle droit de la direction générale de la côte avec la laisse de basse mer au point de coordonnées 1 degré 39 minutes 44 secondes de latitude sud et 41 degrés 33 minutes 34 secondes,4 de longitude est, WGS 84. 3. À l'unanimité, décide que, à partir du point de départ, la frontière maritime dans la mer territoriale suit la ligne médiane, décrite au paragraphe 117 ci-dessus, jusqu'à ce qu'elle atteigne la limite des 12 000 marins, au point situé par 1 degré 47 minutes 39,1 secondes de latitude sud et 41 degrés 43 minutes 46,8 secondes de longitude est, WGS 84.A. 4. Par 10 voix contre 4, décide que, à partir du point où prend fin la frontière dans la mer territoriale, point A, La frontière maritime unique délimitant la zone économique exclusive et le plateau continental en deçà de 200 000 marins entre la République fédérale de Somalie et la République du Kenya suit la ligne géodésique ayant pour azimut initial 114 degrés jusqu'à ce qu'elle atteigne la limite des 200 000 marins mesurée à partir des lignes de base servant à mesurer la largeur de la mer territoriale de la République du Kenya au point situé par 3 degrés 4 minutes 21,3 secondes de latitude sud et 44 degrés 35 minutes 30,7 secondes de longitude est, WGS 84.b. Pour Madame Donoghue, présidente, Monsieur Gevorgyan, vice-président, Messieurs Tomka Benuna, Mesdames Choué Sebutinde, Messieurs Robinson Iwasawa Nolte, juge, Monsieur Guillaume, juge ad hoc. Contre, Messieurs Abraham, Youssouf, Bandari, Salam, juge. 5. Par 9 voix contre 5, décide que, à partir du point B, la frontière maritime délimitant le plateau continental se poursuit le long de la même ligne géodésique jusqu'à ce qu'elle atteigne la limite extérieure du plateau continental ou la zone où les droits d'État tiers sont susceptibles d'être affectés. Pour Madame Donoghue, présidente, Monsieur Gevorgyan, vice-président, Messieurs Tomka Benuna, Mesdames Choué Sebutinde, Messieurs Iwasawa Nolte, juge, Monsieur Guillaume, juge ad hoc. Contre, Messieurs Abraham, Youssouf, Bandari, Robinson, Salam, juge. 6. À l'unanimité, rejette la demande formulée par la République fédérale de Somalie dans sa conclusion finale numéro 4.
President Donoghue appends a separate opinion to the judgment of the court. Judges Abraham and Youssouf append separate opinions to the judgment of the court. Judge Shway appends a declaration to the judgment of the court. Judge Robinson appends an individual partly concurring and partly dissenting opinion to the judgment of the court. Judge Ad hoc Guillaume appends a separate opinion to the judgment of the court. The text of the judgment is available from today in typescript. It will also be available shortly on the court's website. The printed text will be available in the near future. As the court has no other business before it, I declare the sitting closed.